Abstract. Organizations routinely mistake behavioral outcomes for root causes, responding to performance failures only after they become visible in metrics or incidents. This reactive approach overlooks a critical reality: behavior is a lagging indicator of system health. Long before performance crosses failure thresholds, underlying readiness, the capacity of people and systems to maintain safe, effective operation, degrades through accumulating cognitive load, eroding psychological safety, rising threat perception, declining motivation, and increasing fatigue. Drawing on sociotechnical systems theory, resilience engineering, and organizational psychology, this article examines why traditional performance management systems are blind to readiness erosion and presents evidence-based strategies for detecting and addressing degradation before behavioral failure occurs. Through analysis of organizational responses across healthcare, aviation, technology, and manufacturing sectors, the article demonstrates that effective performance management requires shifting from lagging behavioral indicators to leading readiness signals, enabling intervention before systems lose their compensatory margin. The pattern is familiar across industries: an incident occurs, metrics deteriorate, or a critical failure surfaces. Leadership responds swiftly, mandating additional training, tightening procedures, increasing oversight, or reinforcing accountability mechanisms. Yet these interventions often miss the fundamental dynamic at play. By the time behavior crosses into visible failure, the system has already spent months or years depleting its capacity to maintain performance under stress. This phenomenon reflects what Hollnagel, 2014, terms the efficiency-thoroughness trade-off in safety AI thinking. Systems succeed not because they follow procedures perfectly, but because people continuously adapt to bridge gaps between work as imagined and work as done. When readiness erodes, this adaptive capacity diminishes, leaving systems brittle and vulnerable to cascading failure. Woods and Hollnagel, 2006. The challenge for organizations is that conventional performance monitoring systems are designed to detect behavioral deviations, not the upstream conditions that make those deviations inevitable. The stakes are substantial. Research indicates that organizations operating near cognitive capacity thresholds experience 40 to 60% higher error rates even when productivity metrics remain stable. Wickens et al. 2015. Healthcare systems show that burnout, a readiness indicator, predicts patient safety incidents months before they occur, yet most organizations measure burnout only after safety events have materialized. Walp et al. 2015. In technology sectors, technical debt accumulates silently until system reliability suddenly collapses, surprising leadership teams who saw no warning in their dashboards. Allspore, 2012. This article examines why organizations systematically fail to detect readiness degradation, explores the organizational and individual consequences of this blindness, and presents evidence-based approaches for building early warning systems that surface performance erosion before behavioral failure occurs. The performance management paradox: why success masks degradation. Defining readiness in organizational systems. Readiness encompasses the latent capacity of individuals, teams, and technical systems to maintain performance under variable conditions. Unlike performance outcomes, which measure what was accomplished, readiness measures the system's ability to accomplish work safely and effectively as conditions change. Bergstrom et al. 2015. Readiness operates across multiple dimensions. Cognitive readiness, available attentional resources, working memory capacity, and decision-making bandwidth relative to task demands. Wickens, 2008. Physical readiness, energy reserves, fatigue levels, and physiological capacity to sustain effort. Psychological readiness, sense of safety to speak up, motivation to engage discretionary effort, trust in leadership and systems. Edmondson, 1999. Technical readiness, system reliability margins, maintenance currency, technical debt levels, and infrastructure resilience. Social readiness, team cohesion, communication effectiveness, shared mental models, and collective efficacy. Salas et al. 2005. Critically, readiness is dynamic and depleting. Organizations constantly draw down readiness reserves to maintain performance, especially when formal systems are inadequate. The danger emerges when depletion outpaces recovery, a trajectory invisible to outcome-focused metrics until compensatory capacity exhausts completely. The compensation trap: how high performers obscure system failure. Organizations inadvertently create conditions where declining readiness remains hidden through what researchers call adaptation and resilience cycles. Cook and Rasmussen, 2005. When systems or processes create friction, capable individuals compensate, working longer hours, developing workarounds, absorbing coordination costs, or simply trying harder. This compensation paradox explains why organizations can simultaneously exhibit declining readiness and stable performance metrics. A study of emergency departments found that nurses routinely worked through breaks, stayed late unpaid, and developed elaborate informal coordination systems to compensate for inadequate staffing, maintaining patient throughput metrics while their own capacity steadily degraded. Tucker and Spear, 2006. Management saw successful performance and concluded systems were functioning adequately. Decker, 2019, describes this as drift into failure. Small, incremental changes that seem locally rational gradually move the system closer to failure boundaries without triggering alarms. Each adaptation that maintains short-term performance reinforces the illusion of system health while actually consuming the adaptive capacity needed for long-term resilience. The compensation trap creates several dangerous dynamics. Performance masking. Metrics remain green while the effort required to achieve them escalates unsustainably. Attribution errors. When failure eventually occurs, organizations attribute problems to individual behavior rather than system capacity, or reason. 1990. Intervention mismatch. Responses focus on tightening compliance rather than addressing the conditions that required compensation in the first place. Accelerated depletion. Interventions that increase oversight, documentation, or procedural complexity further tax already depleted cognitive resources. State of practice. Current approaches to performance monitoring. Most organizations rely on three categories of performance indicators, all of which function as lagging measures of readiness erosion. Outcome metrics track results, production volumes, revenue, quality scores, safety incident rates, customer satisfaction. These indicators reveal that something went wrong but provide limited insight into why or how to prevent recurrence. A study of manufacturing facilities found that traditional quality metrics detected problems an average of 8 to 12 weeks after the underlying process degradation began. Hines et al. 2004. Behavioral metrics monitor compliance, procedure adherence, attendance, training completion, audit findings. While useful for specific purposes, behavioral metrics suffer from the fundamental limitation that they measure outputs, not capacity. High compliance rates can coexist with severe readiness erosion when people are working scared or exerting unsustainable effort to maintain appearances. Edmondson and Leahy, 2014. Utilization metrics track resource deployment, labor hours, equipment uptime, capacity utilization. Paradoxically, these metrics often reward the very conditions that degrade readiness. Research in healthcare shows that units operating above 92% occupancy experience dramatically higher mortality rates, yet many health systems target 95% plus occupancy to maximize financial performance. Needleman et al. 2011. High utilization leaves no margin for the variation inherent in real-world operations. Recent survey research across multiple sectors reveals that 73% of organizations lack systematic methods for measuring cognitive load, 68% have no regular assessment of psychological safety, and 81% rely exclusively on retrospective incident analysis rather than prospective vulnerability assessment. Provan et al. 2020. This measurement gap ensures that readiness degradation remains invisible until behavioral failure forces attention. Organizational and individual consequences of readiness blindness. Organizational performance impacts. The hidden cost of invisible degradation. When organizations fail to detect readiness erosion early, they pay substantial costs in operational performance, financial outcomes, and strategic capability. Incident rates and safety performance. Research across healthcare, aviation, and energy sectors consistently demonstrates that readiness indicators predict safety outcomes months before incidents occur. A longitudinal study of hospital units found that declining nurse-reported workload manageability predicted patient safety events 12 to 16 weeks later, even when other metrics remained stable. Walp et al. 2015. The lag between cause and effect creates a dangerous gap where organizations believe they are operating safely while risk accumulates invisibly. Quality degradation and rework costs. Manufacturing and software development research shows that quality problems emerge through gradual accumulation of technical debt, process shortcuts, and diminished attention to detail, all consequences of depleted cognitive and organizational capacity. A study of automotive suppliers found that facilities operating with sustained high utilization experienced 35% higher defect rates and 48% higher rework costs compared to facilities maintaining capacity buffers, even though initial inspection pass rates appeared similar. Hopp and Spearman, 2011. Productivity paradoxes and hidden inefficiency. Organizations pursuing aggressive efficiency targets often trigger what economists call diseconomies of scale. Beyond certain thresholds, incremental gains in utilization produce declining returns and eventually performance degradation. Research by Repenning and Sturman, 2001, found that organizations under sustained performance pressure enter firefighting modes where 40 to 60% of organizational capacity shifts to urgent problem solving, leaving insufficient resources for preventive work that would eliminate future problems. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where depleted readiness generates more problems, which further depletes readiness. Talent attrition and capability loss. When readiness erodes, high performers experience the consequences most acutely. They shoulder disproportionate compensation effort and recognize system dysfunction earlier. Research consistently shows that organizations with degraded readiness experience 25 to 40% higher voluntary turnover among top performers, creating a vicious cycle where the loss of adaptive capacity accelerates further degradation. Hausknecht and Trevor, 2011. The financial impact extends beyond replacement costs. Organizations lose institutional knowledge, relationship networks, and the very individuals whose adaptations were masking system inadequacy. Strategic blindness and organizational learning deficits. Perhaps most consequentially, readiness blindness impairs organizational learning and strategic adaptation. When organizations cannot distinguish between healthy performance and unsustainable compensation, they misinterpret signals about what is working. Leaders reinforce the very practices that are depleting the system, mistaking survival for success. Sitkin, 1992, describes this as learning myopia. Organizations optimize for measured outcomes while degrading unmeasured capabilities essential for long-term viability. Individual well-being and stakeholder impacts. The human cost of system degradation. Readiness erosion concentrates harmful impacts on individuals who work within degraded systems and the customers, patients, or citizens they serve. Chronic stress and health consequences. Sustained operation in degraded readiness conditions triggers chronic stress responses with documented health impacts. Research on healthcare workers shows that those in persistently under-resourced settings experience rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder comparable to combat veterans, approximately 2 to 3 times baseline population rates, Schenefeld et al. 2012. These impacts cascade to cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and shortened life expectancy. Moral injury and purpose erosion. When individuals must repeatedly compromise standards or deliver suboptimal outcomes due to system constraints, they experience what researchers term moral injury, psychological distress from actions that violate core values, Litz et al. 2009. A study of teachers found that those working in chronically under-resourced schools reported profound guilt about failing to serve students adequately, even though systemic constraints made excellent teaching impossible, Santoro, 2018. This moral injury drives disproportionate attrition among purpose-driven professionals who entered their fields to make positive contributions. Cognitive exhaustion and decision impairment. Prolonged cognitive overload degrades decision-making capacity through multiple mechanisms. Research demonstrates that cognitive fatigue impairs risk assessment, increases reliance on heuristics over systematic analysis, and reduces capacity to integrate new information, Wickens et al. 2015. In high-stakes domains like healthcare and aviation, these impairments translate directly to errors with severe consequences. Studies show that physicians working extended hours make diagnostic errors at rates 30 to 50% higher than well-rested colleagues, even when they report feeling capable, Barger et al. 2006. Psychological safety collapse and voice suppression. As readiness degrades, organizational environments often become less psychologically safe. People fear negative consequences from raising concerns, admitting uncertainty, or reporting problems, Edmondson, 1999. This creates a particularly toxic dynamic. Precisely when systems most need information about emerging vulnerabilities, individuals become most reluctant to share it. Research in healthcare shows that units with poor safety outcomes consistently exhibit lower psychological safety, creating self-reinforcing cycles where problems multiply in silence. Onemboard and Edmondson, 2006. Service quality impacts on end users. Readiness erosion ultimately degrades service quality for customers, patients, students, or citizens. Research across service sectors shows strong correlations between employee well-being indicators and customer experience metrics, typically with 3 to 6 month lags, with Schneider et al. 2003. In healthcare specifically, patient satisfaction, clinical outcomes, and safety metrics all deteriorate as staff readiness degrades, even when hospitals maintain staffing ratios that meet regulatory requirements. Aiken et al. 2012. Evidence-based organizational responses, detecting and addressing readiness erosion. Effective organizational responses to readiness degradation require fundamental shifts from lagging behavioral indicators to leading readiness signals, and from reactive problem-solving to prospective capacity management. The following interventions draw on evidence from organizations that have successfully implemented early detection and response systems. Implementing readiness monitoring systems, leading indicators that surface erosion early. Organizations cannot manage what they do not measure. Building effective early warning systems requires identifying and tracking indicators that surface readiness degradation before behavioral failure. Cognitive load and attentional capacity assessment. Rather than waiting for errors to reveal cognitive overload, leading organizations implement regular assessment of cognitive demands relative to available capacity. Methods include brief pulse surveys using validated instruments like the NASA Task Load Index adapted for organizational contexts, systematic collection of time to think metrics that track how much of work time involves uninterrupted focus versus constant interruption, and structured observation protocols that identify points in workflows where cognitive demands spike, or Wiggins, 2008. Regular 2 to 3 minute pulse surveys at natural workflow breakpoints asking, how manageable does your current workload feel, using simple 5-point scales. Analysis of calendar data to track percentage of time in meetings versus focused work, with declining ratios signaling capacity erosion. Cognitive budget exercises where teams collectively map task demands against available attention, identifying capacity deficits before they generate errors. Integration of cognitive load assessment into safety and quality reporting systems, treating high cognitive load as a risk factor requiring response. Virginia Mason Medical Center implemented a cognitive load monitoring system that prompts nurses to report subjective workload at shift transitions. When aggregated data show cognitive load trending upward over weeks, the organization treats this as a leading indicator requiring investigation and response, adjusting staffing, simplifying documentation, or addressing system friction, rather than waiting for incident data to confirm problems retrospectively. Psychological safety and voice metrics. Organizations that effectively maintain readiness systematically measure whether people feel safe raising concerns. This goes beyond annual engagement surveys to include regular assessment of whether individuals speak up about problems, whether those who raise concerns face negative consequences, and whether reported issues receive meaningful response. Edmondson and Leahy, 2014. Brief, anonymous weekly or biweekly pulse questions. If you noticed something that could harm quality or safety, how confident are you that you could speak up without negative consequences? Tracking the ratio of near-miss reports to actual incidents. Healthy systems should show 10 to 100 near-miss reports for every incident, indicating active problem detection. Monitoring response time and quality for reported concerns. Systems that take weeks to acknowledge issues signal that voice is not valued. Analyzing patterns of who speaks up and who remains silent, with particular attention to whether junior staff, particular demographic groups, or specific teams show voice suppression. Pixar Animation Studios famously implements brain trust reviews where filmmakers present work in progress and receive candid feedback. The organization explicitly measures psychological safety through post-review surveys and actively intervenes when feedback suggests people are holding back concerns, recognizing that silence about creative or technical problems early in production leads to far more costly problems later. Fatigue and recovery assessment. Rather than relying on attendance metrics or productivity data that reveal only when fatigue has caused visible failure, effective organizations implement proactive fatigue management systems that assess both acute and cumulative fatigue. Regular assessment using validated fatigue scales, or e.g. Chalder fatigue scale adapted for workplace use. Monitoring of work pattern data, consecutive days worked, average hours per day, frequency of after-hours contact, as leading indicators. Team-level tracking of recovery time between high-intensity periods, recognizing that sustained high demands without recovery windows predict performance degradation. Integration of fatigue risk into operational planning, treating it as a constraint like equipment capacity. Air New Zealand developed a comprehensive fatigue risk management system after research showed that fatigue was contributing to operational incidents. Rather than focusing only on compliance with duty time regulations, the airline implemented predictive modeling that assesses fatigue risk based on roster patterns, monitors actual fatigue through surveys and biomeasure options, and enables proactive schedule adjustments when fatigue risk trends upward, preventing incidents rather than reacting to them. Building adaptive capacity through organizational slack and redundancy. Organizations that maintain readiness despite variable demands deliberately build and protect capacity buffers rather than pursuing maximum utilization. Capacity buffer maintenance. Resilience research demonstrates that systems need excess capacity to absorb variation and recover from disruptions. Hall-Nagel et al. 2015. Organizations implementing this principle establish explicit policies maintaining capacity margins. Staffing models that target 80 to 85% utilization rather than 95% plus, providing headroom for variability. Equipment maintenance schedules that prioritize reliability over maximum utilization. Time allocation policies that protect 15 to 20% of knowledge workers' time for learning, improvement work, and recovery. Budget reserves specifically designated for addressing emerging capacity constraints before they generate failures. Toyota's production system famously includes the and cord principle. Any worker can stop the line to address quality problems. This requires maintaining sufficient capacity slack that stopping production does not create crisis. The company views this slack not as inefficiency but as essential infrastructure for maintaining quality and enabling continuous improvement. Research shows that Toyota plants achieve higher productivity and quality than competitors running at higher utilization precisely because slack enables problem solving. Spear and Bowen, 1999. Cross-training and skill redundancy. Organizations vulnerable to readiness erosion often depend on specific individuals whose absence creates immediate capacity crisis. Building readiness requires deliberate development of distributed capabilities. Systematic cross-training programs that develop overlapping competencies within teams. Documentation systems that capture critical knowledge rather than leaving it tacit in individuals' heads. Role rotation practices that build system-wide understanding and prevent capability brittleness. Succession planning that identifies and develops capability before it becomes urgent. The U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine program implements extreme redundancy principles, multiple qualified individuals for every critical role, systematic knowledge transfer protocols, and organizational cultures where taking leave is mandatory rather than optional. This redundancy enables the organization to maintain exceptional reliability even when individual readiness varies. Protected improvement time and learning capacity. Organizations that avoid readiness erosion explicitly protect time and resources for learning, improvement, and preventive work rather than allowing urgent demands to consume all capacity. Innovation time policies, e.g. Google's former 20% time concept, that legitimize non-immediate work. Regular after-action reviews and improvement cycles built into standard workflows. Protected time for professional development and skill maintenance. Systematic elimination of low-value work to create capacity for high-value activity. Microsoft's engineering teams implement one-week periods several times annually where normal feature development pauses and teams focus exclusively on technical debt reduction, tool improvement, and learning. Leadership found that these deliberate pauses, which temporarily reduce output, actually improve productivity over time by preventing the gradual degradation that occurs when improvement work never receives attention. Implementing just culture and learning systems that surface problems early. Traditional accountability systems paradoxically drive readiness erosion by incentivizing problem suppression. Organizations maintaining readiness implement alternative approaches that encourage early problem detection. Just culture principles that separate human error from accountability for conscious choices. The just culture framework distinguishes between honest mistakes, which require system improvement, at-risk behaviors, which require barrier removal and coaching, and reckless conduct, which requires accountability responses. Decker, 2012. This nuanced approach enables organizations to learn from failures without creating fear that suppresses reporting. Clear, communicated criteria for what constitutes honest error versus choices deserving accountability. Investigation processes that focus on understanding system contributions to failures before evaluating individual decisions. Protection for individuals who report their own errors, recognizing that self-reporting enables faster learning. Analysis of patterns rather than individual incidents, repeated similar errors signal system problems requiring design changes. The Veterans Health Administration implemented comprehensive just culture principles following research showing that punitive responses to errors were suppressing reporting and preventing learning. The system now treats most errors as learning opportunities requiring system improvement rather than individual blame, producing dramatic increases in safety reporting and measurable improvements in patient safety outcomes, Obagi et al. 2002. Prospective risk assessment and pre-mortem exercises, rather than learning only from failures that occur, leading organizations implement structured prospective analysis that surfaces vulnerabilities before they generate harm. Regular, pre-mortem exercises where teams imagine that a major failure has occurred and work backwards to identify how it might happen, revealing risks that traditional planning overlooks, Klein, 2007. Systematic vulnerability assessment using tools like bowtie analysis that map pathways from hazards to consequences. Red team exercises where designated individuals actively attempt to find weaknesses in plans or systems. Integration of frontline worker knowledge about near misses and everyday adaptations into risk assessment. Shell Oil implemented systematic capability maturity assessment after disasters revealed that multiple warning signals had been missed. The company now conducts regular prospective assessments where operational teams evaluate their own vulnerability using structured frameworks, with corporate oversight focused on ensuring honesty rather than punishing identified gaps. This approach surfaces concerns early when they remain manageable. Learning systems that close the loop from reporting to action. Psychological safety research demonstrates that willingness to report problems depends heavily on whether reports generate meaningful response, Edmondson, 1999. Effective organizations implement closed-loop systems. Visible tracking of reported concerns from submission through resolution. Regular communication to reporters about investigation findings and actions taken. Public celebration of problem detection and reporting, treating it as valuable contribution rather than criticism. Metrics that track time from report to action as a key organizational health indicator. After a series of software outages, Etsy, or the e-commerce platform, implemented a radical transparency approach to incident learning. Every outage generates a blameless post-mortem published company-wide, with explicit documentation of system vulnerabilities revealed and improvement actions planned. This visibility ensures that learning reaches beyond the immediate team, enables pattern recognition across incidents, and demonstrates that reporting leads to meaningful change, reinforcing the psychological safety needed for ongoing early detection. Designing work systems that reduce cognitive load and support human performance. Rather than expecting people to adapt to poorly designed systems, organizations maintaining readiness invest in system design that reduces unnecessary cognitive demands. Procedural simplification and reduction of administrative burden. Research across sectors shows that well-intentioned compliance requirements gradually accumulate, imposing cognitive tax that degrades core task performance. Leading organizations implement systematic burden reduction. Regular, administrative burden audits that measure time spent on documentation, reporting, and compliance activities relative to core work. Requirements that new compliance demands must identify and eliminate equivalent existing demands, or burden neutrality. Technology systems designed to minimize clicks, reduce mode errors, and support rather than interrupt workflow. Hierarchical procedures that present essential information prominently while making detailed guidance available when needed without imposing it universally. Kaiser Permanente conducted systematic analysis revealing that physicians spent more time on electronic health record documentation than on direct patient care, a major contributor to burnout and cognitive overload. The organization launched multi-year initiatives to simplify documentation requirements, implement better technology interfaces, and redeploy administrative work to non-physician staff. Longitudinal data showed these changes reduced cognitive load and improved both physician well-being and patient care quality, Nguyen et al. 2021. Decision support systems that augment rather than replace human judgment. Effective use of automation and decision support tools requires careful design that enhances human capability without desk-killing or creating brittle dependencies. Automation that handles routine cognitive work while preserving human judgment for complex decisions. Decision support that presents relevant information clearly without overwhelming users with irrelevant data. Systems that make it easy for humans to understand automated reasoning and override when appropriate. Technology design that supports skill maintenance rather than creating operators who cannot function if systems fail. Aviation has implemented sophisticated decision support for air traffic controllers that provides conflict detection and resolution suggestions while maintaining human authority and situational awareness. Research shows these systems reduce cognitive load during routine operations while maintaining controller skills needed for handling unusual situations or technology failures, Wickens et al. 2015. Team structure and coordination systems that distribute cognitive work, rather than concentrating demands on individuals. Effective organizations design team structures that distribute cognitive load. Clear role definitions that prevent coordination demands from overwhelming task execution. Structured communication protocols, e.g. closed-loop communication, SBAR frameworks, that reduce ambiguity without imposing bureaucratic overhead. Team configurations sized appropriately for task complexity, neither too small, overwhelming individuals, nor too large, or creating coordination burden. Physical or virtual workspace designs that support awareness without requiring constant active monitoring. Operating rooms at Geisinger Health System implemented structured team briefing and debriefing protocols that distribute cognitive work across surgical team members rather than concentrating it with surgeons. These protocols reduce cognitive load on individual team members while improving overall team performance, producing measurable reductions in complications and errors, O'Neill et al. 2010. Transparent communication and expectation calibration, aligning work as imagined with work as done. Readiness degradation often reflects misalignment between leadership expectations and operational reality. Organizations addressing this implement transparent communication systems that surface and address these gaps. Regular operational pulse checks that capture frontline reality, rather than relying on lagging metrics or hierarchical reporting that filters bad news. Effective organizations implement direct sensing mechanisms. Leadership rounding practices where senior leaders regularly spend time in operational areas, asking about barriers and capacity rather than inspecting compliance. Anonymous pulse surveys designed to surface specific operational challenges rather than vague satisfaction questions. Town hall formats where frontline staff can directly raise concerns without managerial filtering. Systematic ethnographic observation that reveals work as done rather than work as imagined. Cleveland Clinic implemented walk rounds where executives regularly visit patient care areas specifically to ask staff, what is getting in the way of doing your best work? This simple question surfaces operational friction that would never appear in formal reports, enabling rapid response to emerging capacity constraints before they generate quality or safety events. Honest expectation setting and trade-off discussions. When organizations face genuine resource constraints, transparent acknowledgement and explicit trade-off decisions prevent the silent degradation that occurs when people are expected to achieve impossible outcomes. Frank discussions about what is feasible given actual constraints rather than aspirational planning that ignores reality. Explicit prioritization decisions when capacity is insufficient for all demands. Public acknowledgement when workload is unsustainable, coupled with concrete plans for improvement rather than exhortations to work smarter. Protection for individuals who raise concerns about unrealistic expectations. During a period of rapid growth, Basecamp, or the software company, publicly announced they would slow feature development pace because analysis showed the current trajectory was unsustainable and degrading both product quality and employee well-being. This transparent acknowledgement, which contradicted typical technology industry growth at all costs culture, enabled recalibration of expectations across stakeholders and prevented the burnout and quality degradation common in hypergrowth companies. Narrative integration of learning into organizational knowledge. Organizations that maintain readiness systematically capture and share stories that illustrate the gap between design systems and actual practice. Regular collection and sharing of work as done stories that reveal adaptations required to achieve outcomes. Celebration of problem detection and creative workarounds rather than treating them as deviation. Integration of practitioner narratives into training and system design processes. Public acknowledgement when official procedures prove inadequate for real conditions. NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System collects confidential reports of safety concerns and near misses, analyzes patterns, and publishes sanitized case studies that enable broad learning. This system surfaces information about operational reality that would never appear in formal channels, providing early warning of emerging safety vulnerabilities and enabling proactive response. Building long-term organizational readiness, capability systems for sustained performance. Moving beyond crisis response to sustainable readiness requires building organizational capabilities that make capacity management systemic rather than episodic. Embedding readiness assessment into regular operational rhythms. Organizations that sustain readiness integrate capacity monitoring into standard management practices rather than treating it as a separate initiative. Integration into existing reporting and review systems. Rather than creating parallel readiness monitoring systems, effective organizations incorporate leading indicators into existing operational reviews. This includes adding cognitive load, psychological safety, and fatigue metrics to standard dashboards alongside traditional performance indicators, incorporating readiness discussion into daily huddles and weekly team meetings, and making capacity assessment a standard element of project planning and resource allocation decisions. Development of predictive models and early warning triggers. As organizations accumulate readiness data over time, they can develop predictive models that identify deteriorating conditions before behavioral failure. This includes establishing quantitative thresholds for leading indicators that trigger structured response protocols, analyzing patterns across multiple indicators to identify combinations that predict trouble, and using machine learning approaches to detect subtle patterns human reviewers might miss. Creating organizational cadence for recovery and renewal. Beyond monitoring readiness, sustaining it requires building systematic recovery into organizational rhythms. This includes planned periods of reduced intensity following high-demand periods, explicit seasonal variation that acknowledges not all quarters can sustain peak intensity, and mandatory time-off policies that prevent individuals from chronically depleting personal resources. Developing distributed leadership capacity and sensing networks. Readiness monitoring cannot be centralized. It requires distributed sensing capacity throughout the organization. Training middle managers and team leads in readiness assessment. Frontline leaders need capability to recognize and respond to early degradation signals. This requires structured training in cognitive load assessment, psychological safety concepts, and fatigue recognition, development of skills in conducting exploratory conversations about capacity and barriers, authority to make local adjustments when readiness concerns surface, and accountability for maintaining team readiness alongside productivity outcomes. Building peer networks for pattern recognition. Readiness erosion often manifests differently across units but with common underlying patterns. Organizations benefit from creating structures that enable cross-unit learning, including regular forums where operational leaders from different areas share challenges and compare experiences. Systematic analysis of readiness data across organizational boundaries to identify enterprise-wide patterns, and communities of practice focused on specific readiness domains like cognitive load management or fatigue risk. Empowering frontline problem-solving authority. Organizations with sustained readiness push decision authority downward, enabling rapid local response when capacity concerns emerge rather than requiring escalation through bureaucratic processes. This includes clear frameworks defining which adjustments teams can make autonomously, training and support for frontline problem-solving, and leadership cultures that celebrate local initiative rather than punishing deviation from plan. Aligning incentives and cultural norms around sustainable performance. Maintaining readiness long-term requires ensuring that formal and informal organizational systems reward sustainable practices rather than heroic compensation. Metrics and recognition systems that value readiness maintenance. Organizations inadvertently incentivize readiness depletion when recognition and rewards flow exclusively to short-term output. Rebalancing requires incorporating readiness indicators into performance evaluation and recognition systems, celebrating examples of maintaining sustainable pace over extended periods, publicly recognizing individuals who surface capacity concerns before problems occur, and rewarding proactive capacity management rather than only reactive firefighting. Leadership development that prioritizes long-term system health. Organizational cultures reflect leadership priorities. Developing readiness-oriented cultures requires explicit inclusion of readiness concepts in leadership development programs, selection of leaders who demonstrate capacity management capability alongside results delivery, and accountability for leaders whose units experience chronic readiness degradation even if short-term metrics remain acceptable. Narrative and storytelling that reinforce sustainable norms. Organizational cultures are shaped substantially by the stories that get told and celebrated. Deliberately shaping readiness cultures includes actively sharing stories of early problem detection and proactive response, public discussion of situations where leaders chose to reduce intensity or add resources to maintain readiness, transparent acknowledgement when readiness degradation occurs and how it was addressed, and framing readiness maintenance as core competency rather than optional luxury. Conclusion. The belief that performance problems only become visible when failure crosses thresholds reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex sociotechnical systems operate. Behavior is indeed a lagging indicator, the visible manifestation of readiness that has already degraded to critical levels. By the time traditional metrics signal trouble, organizations have exhausted the adaptive capacity that previously compensated for system inadequacy. This pattern is not inevitable. Organizations across sectors have demonstrated that readiness erosion can be detected and addressed prospectively through deliberate implementation of leading indicator systems, protective capacity buffers, learning cultures that surface concerns early, work design that reduces cognitive burden, and transparent communication that aligns expectations with reality. These interventions share common characteristics. They shift attention from outputs to capacity, they value early problem detection over after-the-fact accountability, they distribute sensing throughout organizations rather than concentrating it at top levels, and they treat readiness maintenance as core organizational capability rather than secondary concern. The business case for this shift is compelling. Organizations that maintain readiness achieve more sustainable performance, experience fewer costly failures, retain critical talent, and develop strategic advantages through superior organizational learning. But perhaps more fundamentally, readiness-oriented approaches recognize that organizational performance ultimately depends on human beings whose capacity is not infinite and whose well-being matters independently of instrumental value. The question posed at the outset, where might readiness be degrading in your system right now without showing up in metrics, demands honest inquiry. Are cognitive demands escalating while attention resources remain constant? Is psychological safety eroding as pressure intensifies? Are individuals compensating for system inadequacy in ways that maintain appearances while depleting their own reserves? Are the people doing the actual work increasingly disconnected from those evaluating whether it is succeeding? Organizations that systematically ask and act on these questions position themselves to manage performance proactively rather than react to failures that were predictable months before they became visible. The shift requires investment, cultural change, and willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about system inadequacy. But the alternative, continuing to operate blind to capacity erosion until behavioral failure forces attention, is far more costly and ultimately unsustainable. The choice is clear. Organizations can continue measuring lag indicators and responding after failure occurs, or they can build the sensing systems, protective structures, and learning cultures that enable prospective readiness management. The latter approach is more demanding but also more humane, more effective, and more aligned with the realities of how complex systems actually maintain performance over time.